Labą dieną, sveikinuosi su jumis, mėly skaitytojai. Esu Živilė Kropaitė, žurnalistė, ir šiandien mes turim nuostabią galimybę pasikalbėti su jūsų visiškai pamėgtu autoriumi, knygos SAVA mirtimi autorium, daktaru Richardu Shepherdu, kurio knyga visiškai topuose jūsų pamilta ir mėgstama ir komentuojama. Mes ją skaitydami ne tik sužinojom labai daug apie tokią medicinos patologo retą ir sudėtingą profesiją, bet taip pat ir apie autoriaus asmeninį gyvenimą, ir mes apie visą tai turėsim galimybę pasikalbėti. Tai aš jau dabar ir pasisveikinsiu. Dr. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Lithuanian readers are thrilled to have an opportunity to talk to you because your book has really been popular in Lithuania. There is this online retailer that is the most popular one, and it has been top 1, top 2, or top 3 for several weeks at least. Wow. And it's really
wonderful.
It is a really popular book, and I wanted to ask you if you expected that success outside of the UK.
No, I didn't expect the success I got in the UK. To be honest, I thought it was an autobiography, a bit of a memoir that would sell some books, but it's sold very well in England. It's sold very well around the world. I think there are now 20 or so translations from Japan to Korea to Lithuania to all sorts of places. So I'm very, very pleased. I'm glad that people find it interesting.
You mentioned it is an autobiography, and it is, and I have mentioned to the readers that we got to know not the very specifics of a forensic pathologist, but also we got to learn about your personal life, which is important to mention because for me, that is how I fell in love with a book. I hated it first because I hated reading about autopsies, postmortems, details of very atrocious and terrible crimes. But then it got me guessing, for example, are they and Jenny, are they going to make it? How come this man, who is such, a top forensic pathologist and is still able to admit that, the truth may also be different than the primary examination suggests, for example. And then I learned to partly skip the terrible bits. And then I really fell in love with the book. And I wanted to ask you, do you get that often, or is it just, me skipping the important details?
No one's admitted leaving bits out, so I shall have to make sure you go back and reread those pieces. No, I think I was absolutely determined that my book was about me and about my journey, as well as the job that I had to do, which had some interesting parts and cases in it as well. Many of my predecessors have written autobiographies, and it's been 10 cases or 20 cases. This is the case I did and nothing else. And I thought it was really important to write about how it had fitted into my life, how I had to manage having 2 young children and a wife who was a medical student and still try and do the job as well. So fitting it all in together was important for me, so that people understood. And I'm very pleased that you found the thread of my life important in the text as a whole.
Let's talk about how you got into forensic pathology a little bit. You talk about that in the book, and you refer to this other book that you read, I think, when you were 14, and when you basically found out that police, barristers, coroners sometimes consult doctors too. And the medical doctor is not necessarily the one that you meet at the hospital, but they do all sorts of other things as well. Would you say now that it was the main reason for your choice of profession?
Oh yes, absolutely. That day and that book completely changed my life. I was a bit naive at 14. Of course, you don't know what professions mean, but I certainly didn't know that doctors could help the police solve crimes, were involved in giving evidence in court. And this book just laid it out in front of me. And seriously, it was a moment where my life completely changed. And I read the book. Well, I to say I read it, I looked at it for a couple of days. And my dad, I think very sensibly, didn't go, "Oh, that's awful, you shouldn't be looking at that at your age." he took it on and he accepted it and worked with me then to guide. He, as a good parent, he guided me then to the things I needed to do to achieve it. And so it really was that one book on that one day. And I'm very grateful to my friend Jeremy, who brought it into school.
I love how you tell about your dad telling you that, you know, if you got this worst grade, he would then remind you that, you know, you won't get into medical school if you keep on doing that. So it was a really great support from your dad. But talking about reasons for the choice of profession, even though you mentioned this book as the main one, you refer to your personal life a lot throughout your book. And you mention how other people, like, for example, your wife, also always referred to your childhood, saying that, you know, this is how you learned not to show his emotions, your emotions, because you lost your mother early.
Yeah.
What do you yourself really think now? How are your early loss of your dearest person in the world, your mother, and your profession actually related?
I think they did weave together. I mean, I think there's no doubt. I mean, my mum died of heart disease when I was 9 years old. For me, it was a shock. Other members of the family knew, but I was too young, I think, to understand exactly what was going on. So actually, the night she died, for me, it was a terrible shock that she had died and gone. And I think I did learn then to suppress emotions. But I also had a wish to understand what had happened. As I grew older, I needed to go back to that age to understand what had happened. And I think that did feed in to my desire to work as a doctor, to understand disease and why people were not just murdered, but why people died suddenly and what diseases killed them. And for quite a long time in my career, when I was performing postmortems on a daily basis, if there was a woman who was 49 years old that my mum was when she died, you know, who had heart disease, there was that resonance, that link between the two that was really quite powerful at times.
You also say that there is no shock for your job in your book. And then in those instances where there would be normally, you know, a situation where one could experience shock. You mentioned Keith Simpson, the very same person who wrote that book we talked about when you got to read at 14, and then you would remember him and think, you know, he didn't talk about shock. And I was just thinking how these role models are important in that sort of a job. How did it help you to always remember him and think about what he would do in certain situations, and how would he get rid of the shock that, you know, you may all experience?
Yes, I never knew him well enough. I was very much the junior doctor, and he was very much then the retired professor. So I met him, but didn't know him. But I met other professors and other people, other mentors in my own profession and in medicine, because remember I trained to be a real doctor first, and then became a forensic pathologist. So there's a lot of learning about your emotions and how you handle them as you train to be a doctor, how you manage injury and death and disease and all these things occur. But thinking about Keith Simpson, he was actually very good vocalizing and discussing his thoughts, but they were kept close to him, if you see what I mean. And so I did realize that you had to be able to separate your emotions from the professional job. If you let your emotions come into your work, it was going to make it less good than it should have been. And so I learned early on, and perhaps that fitted in with my personality. My personality was to suppress the emotions, and so it worked. The two things worked together to make me appear, sometimes certainly to my wife, a rather unemotional and uncaring person.
You also say that, you know, there is less space for emotions whenever you start basing things on scientific facts. And then I just wondered if then when you suppress your emotions, if it's not a worse way out, because then you end up, you know, experiencing terrible things and the treatments that you have to go through, like, you know, like it did happen to you as well.
Yes, I mean, eventually, I mean, after nearly 40 years, there was a moment when all these suppressed emotions came out. And that was very unpleasant and very distressing, and did involve a period of treatment with antidepressant drugs, and going to see a therapist to talk then about 40 years of suppressed and repressed emotions. So that there was a time that it did come out, and I think it probably would have been better for me had I, during my career, had someone to talk to more frequently on a less serious basis. And I try now to help my junior colleagues to understand that going to talk to a psychologist is not a bad thing. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of common sense and looking after your mental health.
But I was surprised that it only took you 6 months to go through that. And I thought, you know, when you say that, I thought I was strong and I could do everything, and then I end up at therapy. The fact that it took such a short period of time, I think it does show you that you are very, very strong.
Well, perhaps. I don't know. For me, I think for some people it takes longer. But, you know, I had a lot of support from mental health professionals, from my psychologist, and from my wife and family. And all of those things enabled me to talk about the things that I hadn't been able to talk about before. And I think there was a huge release of emotion in lots of directions, which was very good.
You were always keen on finding out, investigating whether a particular death isn't more suspicious than it initially seems. That you have mentioned this in the book, and you have always wanted not only to find out a direct reason of a particular death, but also everything related to it. Do you think that it is the main quality? It is what it takes to be top forensic pathologist, to be able to be bothered to double check things, to look for all possible paths to the truth?
Well, I think maybe that's my personality. You know, just simply that is how I am. In my professional life, it is so important for, well, let me start with the most important people, the family of the person who has died. And then the state and the courts also need to know, but the families have got to be certain so that they can begin their grieving process. I mean, if we say someone has died of a heart attack, and then a week later we say, oh no, they didn't have a heart attack, they had a brain hemorrhage, the family has no trust. And I mean, I know it's a very simple thing that hopefully no one would ever get wrong. But, you know, if we don't get it right, then the family loses trust. And once they've lost the trust, their whole process of coming to terms with the death of their loved one can be made much, much harder. So that's why check, double check, recheck, be certain. And if you don't know, then admit that you don't know. It's far better to say, I can't give you an answer, than to pretend you know more than you do.
What is your final take on whether you should meet or whether you should not meet the family of the deceased? Because you do question this in the book, and you sometimes, there is an instance where you meet the family of a girl who I think died of an epileptic seizure.
Yes.
And then you say, you know, maybe it is after all a good idea, no matter how difficult it is, but you sort of are not sure about it throughout the book. So what do you have a final answer to that?
Yes, I think that's a girl called Alana, who died suddenly from an epileptic fit, and talking to her mum and her dad and her sister was very difficult. They were the emotion and the distress was tremendous for that family. But I knew that I held the explanation, the key, and it was so important for me to talk to them so that they had the knowledge that they could use to get over Alana's death. And I think the answer is, I think the pathologist, if the relatives want to talk to the pathologist should always talk to the relative. And it happens in many countries. It's not so common in England. Obviously, if the relatives don't want to talk to the pathologist, we shouldn't force them into a room and tell them things they don't want to hear. And sometimes relatives might not want to hear from you for a week or a month or 6 months or maybe longer. And you need to be ready then to fulfill their needs rather than your needs. And that's, I think, very important.
Right in the very beginning of the book, you questioned whether you should be dissecting the body of a killer with the same respect as any other body. How long did it take you to get used to that and to actually do it, to treat it with the same respect?
I think at fractions of a second, there is that momentary thought. This was a man who had, in a town called Hungerford in England, it was a spree killing, a spree shooting. We hear so much of them now in America. Fortunately, they're very rare in England. But he was the first one. He had shot and killed 13 people, and he'd seriously injured another 13, and then he killed himself. And there was just that moment, you know, my examinations of the victims was done with care and respect. And then we came to examine him, and I thought, do I have to give him the same respect? You know, this is a man who's done terrible things. And yet I knew that I had to, because he too had family, but also that the court and the judicial process required me to get carefully assessed information from him. So yes, it has to be there. And if his family had wanted to talk to me, I would have very happily spoken to them.
It's interesting how you say that any truth depends on interpretation, and there is no moral path that would seem fair and just for everybody. And I was wondering, have you maybe had people who read about their case, their relative's case, obviously, or, you know, of someone they knew in the book, and then contacted you afterwards and said, you know, Dr. Shepherd, there is this case you wrote about. We felt you maybe were not sure about your final conclusion. Could you be maybe so kind and look at your files again?
Yes, there is one case that has actually come back across my desk about every 18 months since 1987, where a man and his friends insist that he is not guilty, and have asked me to relook at it. And we have something in England called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which will look at old cases. And it's outside the courts, but it's an established group of people who will review cases, police officers and lawyers, and it has been referred back to them. And each time they have said, no, the conviction is safe. And that happened again after the publication of this book. They wrote back to me and said, will you look again? And I did look again. And I said, well, I don't change the evidence that I gave in the trial, but I think you're missing the point. The crucial evidence here is not the evidence I gave. The crucial evidence is the evidence of what he did the day before and the day after. By leaving England on a false passport under a false name and doing other things like that is quite incriminating, but is nothing to do with the pathology. So yes, one case, possibly because for legal reasons I've had to change the names of many of the cases in the book. So the names in the book, I have a little paragraph. The lawyers, for various reasons, I've had to change the names of many of the cases, not all of them, because some cases are so well known. For instance, the man who shot 26 people, or Princess Diana, or one or two other things, that they're so well known. I can't.
September 11.
Yes, 9/11. There's a number of things that I can't disguise and wouldn't want to. But individuals, I would actually be upset if someone reading my book accidentally came across their case put out to the public for everyone to read. I mean, they may recognize the case, but hopefully other people wouldn't.
I also am fascinated by, you know, how you really seem to love your job. And there is an episode in your book, you say that, you know, maybe some people have different feelings when they're approaching Westminster Public Mortuary, but then your heart starts beating faster. You start thinking of a new situation, a new story, a new riddle that has to be solved.
Yes.
And I just really wondered, and I wanted to ask you, has it always been this way with every case that you were so enthusiastic? Because there is an episode where you want to take your wife to an opera with a new dress and everything, and then it fails because someone calls, and you have to go, and you're still sort of a little bit, you're blaming yourself for really wanting to do your job because you're feeling bad.
Yes, it's
sad and everything.
Very, very difficult, because yes, that was a very particular evening. We were going to see Tosca, and I had bought her a new dress, and it was a really big evening. And now we have a fixed rota, so that you will have to work Monday night, Wednesday night, Friday night in the week. Then I worked all the time. There weren't enough people around, so I could never be certain of having a night off. And the case was very complex and very difficult, and needed immediate attention. So it was very hard to step away. But Tosca's a very good forensic opera with people being stabbed and jumping off. So I went to what real forensic work and missed out on the operatic forensics.
It's funny how you say it's the forensic opera, and I just wondered, because in one of the talks, you said that you are always fascinated with the human body when you do your work. You don't mention that in the book, at least I don't remember, how you always think, the spinal cord, the skin, the bones, everything works so well together, and it's amazing and it's fascinating. And I then wondered, do you do that in real life as well? I mean, with not dead bodies, but you see someone and you're like, oh my God. Perfect.
Well, all doctors do this. If you're sitting on a train and someone has a limp or a twitch or something like that, you immediately start thinking, well, I wonder what the disease is that person has got. So it's not just pathologists, but not really. I mean, I'm not looking at you thinking, oh, the skull must be this size or this shape, and whatever. But in situations that may be slightly different, if I know someone has had an accident, say, I know a relative of mine had a car accident and she fractured her neck, and I can visualize the fracture that she had in her neck. And I know where it is, and I know what the complications are. So in that sense, yes, but not all the time. I'm not dissecting people as I sit on the bus going into Manchester.
I just remembered, because I'm a radio and TV journalist, and when I started my radio career, I remember I edited a lot, and then people would start talking, and in my mind I would edit this out, I would cut this out, I would cut this out. I think everyone.
Well, there you are. It's when you have an enthusiasm and a love of a job, it is there on the edge of your life. You can stop thinking about it directly, but it's always clicking away things that are going on, and medicine is very much like that. Looking at people, because the first thing we do in an examination is to look at the outside of the person, and look, have they got 2 arms, 2 legs? Have they got any scars? Have they got any obvious disease processes? And that's the start. And so sitting on a bus or a train, these things are there for you to notice.
But have you, going back a little to the love of your job, have you not had cases where, the police would call you and you would have to go on duty and you would think, no, not today, not this again, not the dead bodies?
No, I don't think I ever thought not the dead bodies. What I would think is, this is not convenient. There were times when I was in charge of the children, when just occasionally they would have to come with me and sit in an office for several hours while I had to work. So there were times when, in terms of my family and in terms perhaps sometimes of illness, I really didn't feel that I was as enthusiastic. But you commit to doing a job, and that sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's easy.
What do you think this job has taught you about life? I mean, probably the answer would not be very unexpected, because you do talk about it in the book. You say that it has first of all taught you that death can be very sudden, and that is why it is crucial to enjoy the miracles of life. Do you still follow that ideology?
Yes, I think so. I think that we are all total miracles, total random miracles, when you think about how we have arrived on this world. And I touch on this. Let me quickly give a plug for my second book, which is called The 7 Ages of Death, which deals a little bit with birth, conception, and those things. But the randomness of where we are, and life, I've now of an age where I have had friends who've died in accidents, friends who've committed suicide, friends who've died of diseases, and I'm sort of conscious that life is short. And that I enjoy life, and I try and live it as much as I can to the full, and try not to do anything to excess. But occasionally I drink a bit too much wine, and then I regret it a bit in the morning. But these things are there to be enjoyed.
You mentioned the second book. Would you tell us more a little about it?
Well, the second book is called The Seven Ages of Death, and I should be able to reach a copy. There we are. Oh.
Yeah, we can see. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you so much.
7 Ages of Death. When I was thinking about how to write a further book, I realized that throughout our lives, the things that cause people to die, the things that cause people to be ill, and the things that cause them to suffer accidents and to be murdered change. So the things that affect you as a baby, not many babies are killed in driving motor vehicles, for instance. I mean, a silly example. And that when you become a teenager and you're male, then you have a lot of testosterone, and then you drink alcohol, and you have a motorbike. And those things change as you get older and become middle-aged. Then you drink more alcohol in a different way. So the patterns of our life and disease and death change over those periods. And I just wanted to look at the 7 ages. It links back to in one of his plays, As You Like It, when he talks about the 7 ages of life. And he talks about the baby mewling and puking in his mother's arms, and then the child, and then the soldier, and then finally gets to something where he says sans eyes, sans teeth, sans everything, and it's quite a famous Shakespearean quote. So the 7 ages looks at our life and my life going through those ages, because I come to a point where I realize that actually I'm in the 7th age now, which is a bit sad, but I'm there, and I have to realize that has particular things attached to it.
You mentioned the well-known cases as well that you had to work with. Princess Diana, September 11. What would you say was the most, I don't want to use the word impressive, but what was the one that, stayed in your memory forever, and you went on and you thought, what about that? Maybe we can get something more out of it. Maybe we can come closer to the truth.
I think there are many layers. Working on the Princess Diana case was fascinating. It was such an important case in the United Kingdom, but also around the world. And there were so many conspiracy theories, so many beliefs that were incorrect, that needed to be looked at and analysed, and a proper judgment made in a proper court. So that was fascinating, working on a really high-profile case in a very careful, controlled and organized manner, because I was just one person doing one part. So that was really interesting. 9/11 was interesting because having had mass disasters in England, how it was managed by the New York authorities was impressive, but actually how also the pathology and the science came together, looking at what happened and how it was analyzed, and how much we learnt in retrospect we could actually change our plans. And it's an awful thing to think that mass disasters happen. A lot of people will die in accidents, and people like me have to know how to manage that. We can't just run around trying to make it up on the spot. We have to think and prepare and plan. And so looking at 9/11 and understanding what happened was really, really important. And there are still many families who are very distressed still because they believe that the story told by the state about planes crashing into the building isn't true. And so there are still a lot of people who need assistance with understanding that. But we learned a huge amount, different things, different cases, and I learn also things from each case that I do, I suppose.
And there are some distressed colleagues of yours as well, because what I really remember very well is the story of a colleague who was traumatized so much that she did write her name down on each pieces of her body when she was flying, because she knew she had this experience with different body parts flying around and not knowing who they belonged to. I found that very shocking. But then also talking about you, what other habits like that did you develop, or how many habits did you get rid of? Because you tell about this gin and tonic situation where you
Yes.
you cannot take an ice cube from the bag because it triggers very severe acute anxiety in you, because there was a time when you had to use these ice cubes to cool dead bodies. Anything else?
Well, I've got over the ice cubes in the gin and tonic. I mean, that was amazing. I have got over that. But it's I still don't like taking them out of plastic bags. But it's little things like that. I don't think I've developed many severe reactions to particular things. Pathology is sight and smell and touch, and all of these memories are there. So, things can trigger a memory, even if it's just the smell of something, be it nice or nasty. It can actually trigger a memory. But since I had my breakdown, and since I've had the therapy, I'm much better at analyzing and understanding. I say my therapist always used to talk about taking the memories out of a box and looking at them, and then having the ability to put it back into the box and close the box down again. So now, these things, when they come out, I allow them to come out, and I can look at them and think about them and then put them back and still be safe and not distressed. So there's very little that I ever had, I don't think, that distressed me. And certainly not now. I'm not actively working in the field anymore doing postmortems.
But was that the therapy then that helped you to also get rid of the gin and tonic situation?
Yes, whether that was actually drinking more gin and tonic is a good thing is a different matter. But it was that ice cube, that trigger of seeing those ice cubes, and it goes back to the bombing in a little village, a little island called Bali, which killed a lot of people, and they had real problems with the infrastructure in that place. And so we managed initially with just bags of ice from the supermarket. So that was where that came from. And I didn't notice it at the time. It was only when it acted as a trigger on me at home many years later that it became important.
At some point in your career, you also joined policy making, in a sense. You contributed to some changes policy-wise, in terms of what happens after a person dies. Which are the ones that you are mostly proud of? Is it teaching the police how to restrain people, or is it something else?
Well, I restraint, police holding people, as we know with the case in America, Floyd, police, if they don't do it correctly, can very easily kill people. So I think teaching them how to do that correctly, or being on the committee that taught the people who taught the people, that's really important. And I think despite the number of deaths, it has actually saved a significant number of lives. You don't just have 10 policemen sitting on top of someone. They have learned, which is good. Other things, I think, like helping my colleagues get psychological support throughout their career, and looking back and just teaching medical students. And it's always nice when someone you taught as a medical student becomes a pathologist and says they want to follow you in your career, which is nice. And also writing textbooks. So it's all these things are, I can look back on and think that I made a contribution, and I hope that these are all good contributions and have moved justice on and care of the relatives further forward, so that death, when it happens, if it's traumatic, people will be much better cared for and looked after.
But going back to policy changes, what is still missing, you would say? What is the area which is not really being worked on that could make the life or the work of forensic pathologists easier?
Well, in the United Kingdom, it's the lack of an academic structure in our profession. I mean, it may seem peculiar to many people who hear this, but in England and Wales, remember, we are slightly split up as 4 countries together, but in England and Wales, there is no central authority that really focuses on that, no central teaching authority. And it was broken up by the government, surprisingly, many years ago, and we have lost a lot of room for learning and research as a result of that. So if I really wished it, when I ended my career, I could have brought that back in and given it a structure again, but sadly I'll have to leave that to others who come after me now.
But in terms of psychiatric support for forensic pathologists, is that a real deal now, or is it that Britain is working towards?
No, it's not a real deal, and it's not a real deal because it costs money. that is always the problem. But it's a real deal in the sense that all of my colleagues know what happened to me, and all of my colleagues are strongly advised to get the support. And I'm still working at trying to build in a structure that will mean that they have to go and see a psychologist once a year, whether they talk about football or whether they talk about their personal problems or knitting or babies or whatever. It doesn't matter. But the key thing is to be in a room with someone and to have that ability to talk about your worries and your fears. That's the important thing. So that's coming. It takes time though, and it's partly because we don't have an academic structure, so we're self-employed, so that there is no employer who has a responsibility for us. So it goes round a bit in a circle.
You say that your colleagues know what happened to you. I was wondering how unique your case was, in a sense that you did experience post-traumatic stress disorder, which you sort of refer to in the beginning of the book, but at least to me it wasn't really clear. I wanted to follow up on that story, and it then was laid down on paper really clearly. Yes. You had it. How often does that happen? Do you know?
Well, I think I can't think of any of my colleagues who have been so open and perhaps honest about having it. I can think of several colleagues who have left the profession, and in retrospect, I think I would say they were clearly having big psychological problems, and that maybe we could stop that of happening. So no one else has said what happened to them, but I think there have been significant cases in the past where colleagues have their career has ended, which is a huge shame. But
they ended their careers early on, or
yes, and voluntarily they would step out. They would, one person went off to become a gardener, and one person became a hospital doctor, and one person did something else. But in retrospect, you realise that they were clearly under a lot of stress and strain, and they chose to opt out from it. And not that psychological help would have stopped that happening, but it may have taken some of the pain and the stress out of making that decision. Rather than it being forced on them, it could have been an easier choice.
There is one more topic that I want to briefly touch upon before we move to, conclusions or summing up: the sudden syndrome, death syndrome of babies, because you talk about it explicitly, saying that it's, one of the most difficult things to work on, the deaths of babies. And you also say that when this syndrome sort of appeared, in scientific publications, then all of the babies' deaths were linked to that. Even though you say that you're not actively working so much on cases, what is the situation now? Because me having 2 children, I also was aware of this of the syndrome really early, and then I was so afraid of it that every time I would check if my baby is still breathing, I would check it several times a night, and then it became sort of an obsession. I don't know what's the current situation with this syndrome.
Well, it has progressed. I mean, there's a lot more is now known. Once the good thing about medicine is when it identifies a syndrome, it's not perfect to start with, but then people work at it and begin to, like COVID, it was an awful thing. But then with work and academic study, we understood more and more and more. And the same is true of sudden infant death syndrome. There are some babies who do die unexpectedly and suddenly when they have apparently been well. And some of them are due to heart problems, some of them are due to respiratory problems, some of them are probably due to nervous problems. But the one thing we did discover was that putting your baby to sleep on their back is much safer than putting them lying them on their front. And also things about mattresses and the chemicals used in the mattress and what happens when urine gets onto those chemicals and it produces phosgene and it produces other chemicals that are very poisonous to humans, but particularly to babies. So there are many things. Slowly, we've understood more and we've been able to advise parents much better. I mean, my daughter's just had a baby, it's 10 weeks old now, so I'm really well into the care of young babies and the worries that every mother and father has for their child, and trying to balance it. I mean, this new baby has a baby alarm which will beep if it stops moving, which is great. Except the trouble is, babies when they fall asleep stop moving, and so the alarm is going off so often. But that's perhaps better. There are many things, and now also we have the sudden adult death syndrome, and we've had footballers collapsing on the football field, and other young people, usually fit and healthy, collapsing and dying, and it's due to little abnormalities down at the cellular, the molecular level in the heart. And now we can treat these, we can identify them, now we know what they are, we can treat them and manage them and save people's lives, which is the really good bit of forensic medicine and pathology, and we can actually move on and save lives.
Congratulations on being a granddad, and also we want to know the everyday reality of a granddad, a media personality, writer, Dr. Richard Shepherd today. Tell us a little about it.
Well, not much, I'm afraid. I'm not very good with babies.
No, but not in terms of babies in general. How does your day look like?
My day is wonderfully varied. I mean, throughout my career it was varied. I would wake up in the morning and never be quite sure whether I would be in England in the evening or be on a plane going to America or Bali or the Caribbean or wherever. So my life has always been very varied and very changeable. As a retired person now, I do a little bit of pathology, a little bit of writing. I keep bees, I fly aeroplanes, and I mend clocks. So I have 2 dogs, so I walk them, and they're my constant companions. So my life, yes, my life is very variable, and I have to say the day is never long enough for all the things I want to do.
Tell us, because we're not in the UK, and tell us a bit of how much wanted you are by the media. Remember when there was the Princess Diana's case, I saw when I Googled you and I saw these headlines, how, you worked with that case, and there were headlines saying Princess Diana could have survived and things like that. How exhausting or how exciting all of this was and still is to you, this media world where you are a popular forensic pathologist?
It doesn't involve me much. To be honest, I will do a few interviews a month, maybe 1 or 2 a month. So it's not permanent. I mean, I have a television series coming out in the UK soon, so I am just about to do some more interviews. And of course, you very kindly have got my book in Lithuania, which is wonderful, you know, and it's lovely to do these interviews around the world. But most of the time, I just quietly get on with my life with 2 dogs asleep at my feet, sat at my desk, writing and reading and mending clocks. It's wonderful.
Mending clocks and keeping bees, you said as well?
Yes, 2 very different things. The honey is much better from the bees than from the clocks.
And last but not least, this series that you mentioned in Lithuania, I don't expect we would be able to see it as early as they would in the UK, but what is it about, and are you excited?
Oh, yes, very excited. It's 10 really interesting, complex cases, 7 from the UK, 3 from America, lovely twists and turns, some good pathology, some interesting stories, and it's called The Truth About My Murder is the British name, and it's on CBS Reality starting in September. So I don't know whether it goes to, well, I don't understand how these things are distributed, but yes, possibly. But I hope that too will come to Lithuania, because it's really interesting, and it's a very different aspect of my life to be working in that context with the media, and to be working with film crews and going to places. But you know, different, exciting, and interesting.
That was really interesting. Thank you so very much. I really hope that this interview will contribute to this book continuing to be very, very popular in Lithuania.
Thank you.
And maybe you have a final word to our readers. You know, maybe you want to encourage them to enjoy life as you do in your book.
I think that awful things do happen, but they happen very infrequently. So life is a very precious thing. So enjoy it. You know, look after yourself, look after your friends and your family, and just keep safe.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. Have a good rest of the summer. And we hope to see you again. And good luck with all your work. Thank you so much, Dr. Shepherd.
Thank you.